Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, my beautiful hot messes. My name is Mistress Lavender, and today I will be reading The Subtle Art of Not Giving an F by Mark Manson. I'm on chapter 4, The Value of Suffering. Now, if you missed the chapters before, no worries, just click the videos beforehand and then come back to this one. And, and in the meantime, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Are you ready? Chapter 4, The Art of Suffering. In the closing months of 1944, almost a decade of war, the tide was turning against Japan. Their economy was floundering. The military overstretched across half of Asia, and the territories they had won throughout the Pacific were now toppling like dominoes to U.S. forces. Defeat seemed inevitable. On December 26, 1944, Second Lieutenant Hiroru Udanda of the Japanese Imperial Army was deployed to the small island of Lubang in the Philippines. His orders were to slow the United States' progress as much as possible, to stand and fight at all costs, and to never surrender. Both he and his commander knew it was essentially a suicide mission. In 1945, the Americans arrived on Lubang and took the island with overwhelming force. Within days, most of the Japanese soldiers had either surrendered or been killed, but Unanda and three of his men managed to hide in the jungle. From there, they began a guerrilla warfare campaign against the U.S. forces and the local population, attacking supply lines, shooting at stray soldiers, and interfering with American forces in any way they could. That August, half a year later, the United States dropped atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered, and the deadliest war in human history came to its dramatic conclusion. However, thousands of Japanese soldiers were still scattered among the Pacific Isles, and most, like Unanda, were hiding in the jungle, unaware that the war was over. These holdouts continued to fight and pillage as they did before. This was a real problem for rebuilding Eastern Asia after the war, and the governments agreed something must be done. The US military, in conjunction with the Japanese government, dropped thousands of leaflets throughout the Pacific region announcing that the war was over and it was time for everyone to go home. Onanda and his men, like many others, found and read these leaflets, but unlike most of the others, Unanda decided that they were fake, a set trap by the American forces to get the guerrilla fighters to show themselves. Unanda burned the leaflets, and he and his men stayed hidden and continued to fight. 5 years went by. The leaflets had stopped, and most of the American forces had long since gone home. The local population of Lubang attempted to return to their normal lives of farming and fishing. Yet there were Hiro Unanda and his merry men still shooting at the farmers, burning their crops, stealing their livestock, and murdering locals who wandered too far into the jungle. The Philippine government then took a drawing up new flyers and spreading them across the jungle. Come out, they said, the war is over, you lost. But these too were ignored. In 1952, the Japanese government made one final effort to draw the last remaining soldiers out of hiding throughout the Pacific. This time, letters and pictures from the missing soldiers' families were airdropped along with a personal note from the emperor himself. Once again, Unanda refused to believe that the information was real. Once again, he believed the airdrop to be a trick by the Americans. Once again, he and his men stood and continued to fight. Another few years went by, and the Philippine locals, sick of being terrorized, finally armed themselves and began firing back. By 1959, one of Unana's companions had surrendered and another had been killed. Then, a decade later, Unana's last companion, a man named Kozuka, was killed in a shootout with the local police while he was burning rice fields, still raging war against the local population a full quarter century after the end of World War One. Ananda, having now spent more than half of his life in the jungles of Lubang, was all alone. In 1972, the news of Kozuka's death reached Japan and caused a stir. The Japanese people thought the last of the soldiers from the war had come home years earlier. The Japanese media began to wonder if Kusaka had still been on Lubang until 1972, then perhaps Unanda himself, the last known Japanese holdout from the World War II, thought still might be alive as well. That year, both the Japanese and Philippine governments sent search parties to look for the I don't know how to say this word, so I have my handy dandy pen. It's Enigmatic. I'm going to try it. Enigmatic, second lieutenant, and now myth part hero and part ghost. They found nothing. As the months progressed, the story of Lieutenant Unanda morphed into something of an urban legend in Japan. The war hero who sounded too insane to actually exist. Many romanticized him, others criticized him, others thought he was the stuff of fairy tale, invented by those who still wanted to believe in a Japan that had disappeared long ago. It was around this time that a young man named Noro Suzaki first heard of Unando. Suzaki was an adventurer, an explorer, and a bit of a hippie. Before Born after the war ended, he had dropped out of school and spent 4 years hitchhiking his way across Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, sleeping on park benches, in strangers' cars, in jail cells, and under the stars. He volunteered on farms for food and donated blood to pay for places to stay. He was a free spirit and perhaps a little bit nuts. In 1972, Suzaki needed another adventure. He had returned to Japan after his travels and found the strict cultural norms and social hierarchy to be stifling. He hated school. He couldn't hold down a job. He wanted to be back on the road, back on his own again. For Suzaki, the legend of Huro Unando came as the answer to his problems. It was a new and worthy adventure for him to pursue. Suzaki believed that if he would be the one to find Unandu, sure, search parties conducted by the Japanese, Philippine, and American governments had not been able to find Unandu. Local police forces had been scavenging the jungle for at least 30 years with no luck. Leaflets of Thousands of leaflets had met with no response. But F it, this deadbeat college dropout hippie was going to be the one to find him. Unarmed and untrained for any sort of ooh, not renaissance, it's like resonance or whatever, I'm gonna underline it, or tactical warfare, Suzaki traveled to Lubang and began wandering around the jungle all by himself. His strategy: scream Udanu's name very loudly and tell him that the emperor was worried about him. He found Unandu in 4 days. Suzaki stayed with Unandu in the jungle for some time. Unandu had been alone by that point for over a year, and found by Uzaki, he welcomed the companionship and was desperate to learn what was happening in the outside world from a Japanese source he could trust. The two became sort of kind of friends. Suzaki asked Unandu why he stayed and continued to fight. Unandu said it was simple. He had been given the order to never surrender, so he stayed. For nearly 30 years, he had simply been following an order. Unandu then asked Suzaki why a hippie boy like himself came looking for him. Suzaki said that he'd left Japan in search of three things: Lieutenant Unandu, a panda bear, and the abominable snowman, in that order. The two men had been brought together under the most curious of circumstances. Two well intentioned adventurers chasing false visions of glory. Like a real life Japanese Don Cusack and Sacho Panzu stuck together in the damp recesses of Philippine jungle, both imagining themselves heroes, despite both being alone with nothing, doing nothing. Unando had already by then given up most of his life to a phantom war. Suzaki would give up his life too, having already found Huaru Unandu and the polar bear. He would die a few later in the Himalayas, still in search for the abominable snowman. Humans often choose to dedicate large portions of their lives to seemingly useless and destructive causes. On the surface, these causes make no sense. It's hard to imagine how Unandu could have been happy on the island for 30 years, living off insects and rodents, sleeping in dirt, murdering civilians decade after decade, or why Suzaki trekked off his own death with no money, no companions, and no purpose other than to chase an imaginary Yeti. Yet later in his life, Unandu said he regretted nothing. He claimed that he was proud of his choices and his time on Lubang. He said that he had been honored to devote a sizable portion of his life in service to a non existent empire. Suzaki, had he survived, likely would have said something simpler, that he was doing exactly what he was meant to do, that he regretted nothing. These men both chose how they wished to suffer. Huaro Unandu chose to suffer for loyalty to a dead empire. Suzaku chose to suffer for adventure, no matter how ill advised. To both men, their suffering meant something. It fulfilled some greater cause, and because it meant something, they were able to endure it, or perhaps even enjoy it. If suffering is inevitable, if our problems in life are unavoidable, then the question we should be asking is not, how do I stop suffering, but why am I suffering? For what purpose? Huaru Unandu returned to Japan in 1974 and became kind of a celebrity in his home country. He was shuttled around from talk show to radio station. Politicians clamor what? Clamored to shake his hand. He published a book and he was even offered a lump sum of money by the government. But what he found when he returned to Japan horrified him: a communist, capitalist, superficial culture that had lost all the traditions of honor and sacrifice upon which his generation had been raised. Unanda tried to use his sudden celebrity to espouse, I don't know what that means, ESPOUSE, the values of old Japan. But he was tone deaf to this new society. He was seen more as a showpiece than as a serious cultural thinker, a Japanese man who had emerged from a time capsule for all to marvel at. Like a relic in a museum, and in the irony of ironies, Unando became far more depressed than he'd ever been in the jungle for all those years. At least in the jungle, his life had stood for something. It had meant something. That had made him that had made his suffering endurable. Indeed, even a little bit desirable. But back in Japan, in what he considered to be a vacuous nation, VACUOUS nation, full of hippies and loose women in Western clothing, he was confronted with the unavoidable truth that his fighting had meant nothing. The Japan he had lived and fought for no longer existed, and the weight of this realization pierced him in a way that no bullet ever had. Because his suffering had meant nothing, it suddenly became realized and true 30 years wasted. And so, in 1980, Unandu packed up and moved to Brazil, where he remained until he died. The self awareness onion. Self awareness is like an onion. There are multiple layers to it, and the more you peel them back, the more you're likely going to cry in inappropriate times. Let's say the first layer of self awareness onion is a simple understanding of one's emotion. This is when I feel happy. This makes me feel sad. This gives me hope. Unfortunately, there are many people who suck at even this most basic level of self awareness. I know because I'm one of them. My wife and I sometimes have a fun back and forth that goes something like this: Her, what's wrong? Me, nothing's wrong, nothing at all. Her, no, something's wrong, tell me. Me, I'm fine, really. Her, are you sure? You look upset. Me, with nervous laughter. Really, no, I'm okay, seriously. 30 minutes later, me. And that's why I'm so effing pissed off. He just acts as if I don't exist half the time. We all have emotional blind spots. Often they have to do with the emotions that we were taught were inappropriate growing up. It takes years of practice and effort to get good at identifying blind spots in ourselves and then expressing the affected emotions appropriately. But this task is hugely important and worth the effort. The second layer of self awareness onion is the ability to ask why we feel certain emotions. These why questions are difficult and often take months or even years to answer consistently and accurately. Most people need to go to some sort of therapist just to hear these questions asked for the first times. Such questions are important because they illuminate what we consider success or failure. Why do you feel angry? Is it because you failed to achieve some goal? Why do you feel lethargic and uninspired? Is it because you don't think you're good enough? This layer of questioning helps us believe the root cause of the emotions that overwhelm us. Once we understand the root cause, we can ideally do something to change it. But there's another, even deeper level of the self awareness onion, and that one is full of effing tears. This third level is our personal values. Why do I consider this to be success, failure? How am I choosing to measure myself? By what standard am I judging myself and everyone around me? This level, which takes consistent questioning, it takes constant questioning and effort, is incredibly difficult to reach. And it's the most important because our values determine the nature of our problems. And the nature of our problems determine the quality of our lives. Values underlie everything we are and do. If what we value is unhelpful, if what we consider success or failure is poorly chosen, then everything based upon those values, the thought, the emotions, the day to day feelings, will be all out of whack. Everything we think and feel about a situation ultimately comes back to how valuable we perceive it to be. Most people are horrible at answering these why questions accurately, and this prevents them from achieving a deeper knowledge of their own values. Sure, they may say they value honesty of a true friend, but then they turn around and lie about you behind your back to make themselves feel better. People may perceive that they feel lonely, but when they are asked why they feel lonely, they tend to come up with a way to blame others. Everyone else is mean, or no one is cool or smart enough to understand them, and thus they further avoid their problem instead of seeking to solve it. For many people, this passes as self awareness. And yet, if they are able to go deeper and look at their underlying values, they would see that their original analysis was based on avoiding responsibility for their own problem. Rather than accurately identifying the problem, they would see that their decisions were based on chasing highs, not generating true happiness. I'm going to stop there. I'm at the top of 73. So in the next video, I'm going to start at most self-help gurus. And if you hear the mistakes, honestly, I don't even care because it's all about learning. That's the whole point of reading is to educate our minds, to gain better knowledge and get better vocabulary and learn something from it. But I'm so glad you joined this video. And remember, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. See you next video.